Hello, New Prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 for April 8th, 2021. Hope you're doing well on this day. Hope you've had a great week so far. And we got some interesting texts for today. So we've got Leviticus 11 and 12. Got two chapters in Leviticus today. We got Psalm 13 and 14, two chapters in Psalms today. And then we have Proverbs 26 and 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. We'll start with the other end of the spectrum today. We'll start with Leviticus. And I hope you are persevering through Leviticus. It's starting to get probably a little bit tedious for you at this point. But we do have a shift in chapters now as we talk about laws of approaching a holy God in the first 10 chapters with things like sacrifice and the priesthood. Now we're talking about laws of living in the presence of a holy God. So remember that the totality of Leviticus is really about how to live in covenant relationship with the Lord. So how do we approach the holy God? Well, we do it through sacrifice. We do it through a priesthood in the New Testament context, of course. Both these things fulfilled in the person of Jesus because he is that once for all sacrifice and he is our great high priest. And now this is teaching the Israelites something about, well, now that you're in that relationship, how do you live in the presence of holy God? Well, you do it through an understanding of who God is and the understanding of his holiness and God's desire for us to be holy and to be separate and distinct. And so much of what we find in the rest of these chapters in Leviticus will be dedicated to this theme of holiness. And holiness, again, is that just that basic attitude of being basic, not just attitude, but status or state of being separated from the world and dedicated to God. Well, one of the things that the Israelites were to do is to have ritual purity. And so in chapter 11 and 12, we start talking about some of those things that can make the Israelites unclean or ritually impure, or clean, ritually pure. And so things like, and these are not things that are inherently bad, like bacon, or childbirth, as in chapter 12, but they are things that God, I think, is using in a very visible way to teach the Israelites something about the spiritual realities of who he is as a pure and holy God, and about who they are supposed to be as a holy people. So these ideas of cleanness and uncleanness teach some very important spiritual lessons to the Israelites. One other thing that it teaches them is that it teaches something about the nature of impurity itself, that if you look at the Israelite, these laws of purity and impurity, impurity is something that is very communicable. In other words, if you come into contact with something like a dead body, like at the end of chapter 11, that is something that makes you impure. And if you come in contact with somebody who is impure, that also makes you impure. Whereas purity is something that is not communicable. So a pure person doesn't make an impure person impure. And I think that teaches, some very important spiritual lessons, even for the Jewish people, right? Because they were to be separated from the world around them, and the world had a much greater likelihood of making them impure than them making the world pure. That's something that God does. Purity is something that God grants, not something that we give to the world in a sense. So I hope that makes sense. So it's some interesting spiritual lessons taught by the book of Leviticus here. Moving on, we'll just go on through to Psalm 13 and 14. So Psalm 13 is a lament psalm. It's if you wanted to use the term parade example of a lament, this is it, because it begins with that question, and then the petition, and the complaint, and then finally an expression of confidence that God will meet the need. And then we have Psalm 14, which is a psalm that is of great significance because it is one that is quoted extensively in the New Testament, particularly by Paul in Romans chapter 3. So this is where it says, "The fool said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have committed abominable deeds. There is no one who does good. The Lord has looked down upon heaven, upon the sons of men, to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. They have all turned aside, together they've become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one. And of course, Paul summarizes that in Romans 3 by saying that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. There in Romans, he's talking about how it doesn't matter if you're Jew or Greek or Gentile, you are sinners before God. Now, a Jewish person might read this, at least in the first part of it, and say, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Well, who is the fool? Well, they're perhaps were thinking in Paul's day or in Jesus's day, well, the fools are the folks out there, or maybe we think that as well. The fools are the ones who are saying there is no God. They're the ones who are corrupt. They're the ones who committed abominable deeds. But then the psalmist here comes and says, no, there's no one who does good. There's no one who has sought after the Lord. There's no one who has not turned aside. They have all become corrupt. Notice the universal statements, right? This is not something that is just for one category of people. This is for all people who have ever lived, that we all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And as I've said before, I'm not sure how that we fully grasp how far short we have fallen. And so this is important truth, starting point of any gospel conversation, is to realize that we are in need of salvation. We are in need of something. And so this psalm kind of leaves us with a question, doesn't it? How are we, who are far from God, who haven't done good, who haven't sought understanding, who haven't sought after God? And this is not just a negative. We have not done the positive things, right? We have not done the positive righteousness that God requires. How are we going to be reconciled to God? And we'll answer that question tomorrow as we look at Psalm 15 and 16. So that brings us to, we're working our way through to Proverbs 26, I believe, for today. And this continues the Proverbs of Hezekiah, that he commissioned the collections of these Proverbs. And this, of course, is one of the more famous Proverbs, probably one of the more ones you've heard quoted more than any of the others, or than a lot of the others. Is verse 11, like a dog returns to his vomit, so is a fool that repeats his folly. And that's the one that's most often quoted. But I think the more sobering one is what we find in verse 12. Do you see a man wise in his own eyes? There's more hope for a fool than for him. So the fool, who's kind of running around doing his own thing, who's not living his life wisely, who's not fearing the Lord, who is not living his life to honor God, who's not rightly understanding God, that person has his own problems. But even worse is a man who is someone who is wise, but not wise in the way that God would consider him wise, but wise in his own eyes, who thinks that he or she, that person thinks that they are they have this pride about them, and their knowledge and their understanding and their ways of navigating life, not giving appropriate credit or acknowledgement to God. That person is in worse shape than the person who is just a simple fool. That's a pretty sobering text, isn't it? And then that brings us finally to the end of 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. Paul's continuing here with some exhortations on the end times. And he talks about here the day of the Lord. Now, that's an Old Testament concept, talked about much in many of the prophets, Obadiah. You've got Amos, I believe, that talks about the day of the Lord concept. Joel, of course, is a big concept in the book of Joel. And this is where God inserts himself into human history to bring about his plans and purposes. So in the Old Testament, there are many days of the Lord. But Paul here is talking about the day of the Lord, the day in which God will bring all things, insert himself into history, ultimately to bring about the end of history. And that is when Christ comes again, the second coming. And this is not meant to scare, but it's meant to encourage. So there are people who will be saying peace and safety, destruction will not come upon us, but it will come when we least expect it, Paul says. And so what we need to do is encourage one another with this and build one another up with this so that we will live with expectancy and with urgency. We've seen this theme before, but this is not a text um, meant to. I mean, sometimes it's used as kind of a warning text and a text to get people to respond to the gospel and things like that. But really, for God's people, these types of encouragements are there so that we can encourage one another and build one another up, specifically to live with urgency and live with expectancy. So it's a good, I think, final encouragement for us today as we close off our discussions on these texts and we close our discussion of First Thessalonians. By the way, I didn't mention this, but Paul, as is typical, includes some final exhortations at the end. And probably the most famous is verses 16 through 18. Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, and everything give thanks. One brief comment on that. Notice the absolutes here, the superlatives. Rejoice sometimes, pray occasionally, and some things give thanks. No, he doesn't say that, does he? He uses these again, universals, these superlatives. Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, and everything give thanks. And I think this is kind of it's almost like Paul's psalm here, where he is closing with these final exhortations, but talking about that type of life. What is the life that's living with expectancy and urgency? Well, if you're living with expectancy and urgency, you will be looking forward to the time that Christ comes again. You will always be rejoicing. Know that you have that hope of Christ. You will always be praying, because prayer is our lifeline to the Father, and we will always be giving thanks because and everything, because everything is will work for the glory of God in the end. And so anyway, hope that encourages you on this day, April 8th, 2021. Hope you have a great rest of the day.